Assassin's Creed Shadows is probably one of the best looking games I've seen recently, but that does come at a cost. Right, currently we are running the very ultra high preset, custom ultra preset actually, so one above the highest preset you can select in game by manually selecting some additional options. And we are running on an RTX 5080 with a 7800 X3D, and that again is paired with 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000 megatransfers per second CL30 memory. Right, so currently we're at 1440p as I said on the ultra high preset, and we do have full ray tracing enabled. We're getting 50-ish frames per second, right? So let me just show you the settings here quickly before we continue with our benchmark run. If we, it's called display and scalability, right? Scalability would just be advanced graphics options, whatever. So 1440p, I do use an Elgato 4KX capture card, so everything is captured on a secondary PC so that there's no performance impact whatsoever with my recordings. We are running a DLAA Native, and scalability, we do have diffuse and specular everywhere, so that's the max ray tracing option. Overall preset says custom, but it's because if you select the ultra high preset, ray tracing quality and BVH quality are set to very high instead of ultra high. So I select ultra high, and the same goes for terrain detail. So these options are all set to their highest, and then terrain detail you can also, or terrain quality you can also set to ultra high. You can see that we do not have an apply option because that's the settings that I'm using. Now it is very computationally expensive here, getting 50-ish frames per second, but then again it is native with full ray tracing, and the game really looks fantastic. The lighting, everything looks very good on the highest RT settings here, but it is very heavy. Now I did make a Twitter post earlier where I showed that my GPU power usage was sitting at around 200 watt, but it was actually 180 watt in the Twitter post. But after restarting the game, I'm seeing to 180 watt usage. I don't know what caused the previous hit, and the performance is better. This is the second time I'm recording this run here. Previously I was sitting between 30 and 40 frames per second in this specific run. I'm going to do this specific run because there's a lot of particles here, a lot of shadows, a lot of lighting, and then we also do have some water. This is why I've chosen this specific spot, right? So it's going to be a little bit boring, but I do think it gives us a good idea of different aspects of the game and how they affect performance here. So one thing that I did notice is some of the settings only requires a reload of your save, and other settings require a full restart. So sometimes the game will restart and sometimes it'll just reload a save. All right, so on these settings, let's just see if we can actually get 60 frames per second using DLSS Quality. Previously I couldn't, and I'm very curious to see whether I can now, because as I said, the performance is, the GPU power draw is much higher than it was previously. Unfortunately, we're still dropping below 60 frames per second, but I was not seeing 60 frames per second as often as I'm doing now. So there definitely was something wrong. So if your performance is less than expected, okay, let me rephrase that. The performance is less than expected, right? But if you suspect that that your system is supposed to be performing a little bit better, just restart the game or restart the PC, see if it actually fixes it. Because for me, it did help a little bit. Although our GPU usage is now sitting at 240 watt, it's still much higher than what it was previously. So that is good to see, but also strange to see, because I did not change anything else except restart the game. Now you can see that the view distances, I think it's amazing, right? This is not the Snowdrop engine that they used for Avatar and Star Wars Outlaws. This is the Anvil engine, so it's a different engine, but the ray tracing in this game and the lighting, it really looks fantastic. All right, so 60 frames per second on the ultimate highest preset, or the ultimate highest setting. I don't think it's that horrible, right? Now I want to test frame generation here as well on these settings. I'm not going to be testing too many settings here. I just want to give you an idea what the performance is like. My videos do tend to get long, and even though I do try and make them shorter, they end up being very long anyway. So Anyway, so with frame generation, we'll probably get around 100 frames per second here, right? Which is not ideal for me personally, because this means we are seeing a base frame rate of around 50 frames per second, and with that comes the input latency of slightly less than 50 frames per second. Okay, so I think the game looked great on the highest setting, 120-ish frames per second. If you do play on a controller, the input latency using frame generation is not going to be a bother at all if you get 120-ish frames per second, right? So what I'm going to be doing is, let's just drop down the disable DLSS, not that way. So let's just disable DLSS and disable frame generation. It does support FSR frame generation as well, and I believe it does support XSS2, which I'll be testing with the B580 after this video. All right, so there's really not that big a difference in the frame rate between ultra high and the custom setting that I used, like 2 frames per second maybe. So I'm going to drop down to the very high preset here. Just note that the Ray Trace Global Illumination setting does not change with the overall preset. You have to select it separately. So we do have diffuse and specular lighting, then we have diffuse everywhere, and then we have diffuse hideout only. So this means that ray tracing does not get applied to the world, it's just in your hideout. Okay, so we're going to start off on the very high preset here. No, we have to apply. And now we have to just reload our save. But what I was saying before I was rudely interrupted is we're not using any upscaling or anything now, and I think I might die. Okay, that was quite a jump. I missed the haystack. So we're basically getting around 60 frames per second now. So basically almost the same frame rate, maybe slightly lower than what we had on the custom ultra high preset with DLSS Quality. So just on the native resolution without frame generation, without DLSS, we are getting around 55 frames per second. Now, I'm a high refresh rate gamer. I do have a 165 Hz 1440p panel that I use an RTX 4090 and a 5080 to drive. So I really do like my higher frame rates. And this game is not giving me that. Okay, so if we go ahead and just enable some DLSS upscaling here, just going to use quality. We'll do DLSS scaling as well just on this preset. Just want to show you another thing that I picked up. Now DLSS quality, we're above 70, I mean we're above 70 frames per second just so far all the time. It might drop below 70, but you should be above 60 frames per second at all times. Maybe not in the intro section of the game. There's a lot of smoke and fire effects going on there, and it is very heavy there. All right, but 70 frames per second here, I don't think it's a horrible experience, right? So let's just stand still here. I'm going to get rid of the lows, and 73-ish frames per second. I'm going to test some DLSS scaling, because previously what I saw before I restarted the game is that there's no real scaling with DLSS. Okay, so if we go to balanced, remember we were seeing 73, 74 frames per second. Very little scaling, 77 frames per second. Our GPU power does drop, but our GPU usage still stays at 97%. Okay, so there does seem to be something going on here with how upscaling interacts with ray tracing. One graphical engineer, designer, whatever, speculated that maybe they use probe-based ray tracing, and that does not really scale that well with upscaling or resolutions, right? Certain probes, those probe-based ray tracing. And if we then try performance, so we gained 5 frames per second going from DLSS quality to DLSS performance. Okay, the game does have DLSS 4. It does have the new frame generation model as well. That's why when we enable frame generation, the frame time graph becomes thick, and the recording of the lows is not accurate. So I'm not going to be testing many upscaler settings here. We'll just be testing quality. Please note that it does say here 44% for quality and 34% for balance, and then 25% for performance. That is the correct resolution scale, right? Because typically people would or developers would say 67% for quality, but that's per axis. So 0.67 times 0.67 will get you to 44%, and that is DLSS quality is basically 44% of the amount of pixels, okay, but 67% of the resolution scale on the x-axis and on the y-axis. So don't get too confused. The scaling works fine. I saw a post. The scaling does. I'm not saying the scaling works fine. The scaling is correct. I saw a post on Twitter accusing Ubisoft of changing the scaling options to lie about performance. That's not the case. I'm not a Ubisoft defender, but we need to stick to facts if we want to criticize, right? So 70-ish frames per second here. I think this is basically where I'm going to be playing the game, right? But I will use frame generation, and now with frame generation there is some overheads. Okay, if we double our frame rate by using DLSS frame generation 2 times, because that's what the game natively supports, yeah, we should be getting 140 frames per second, right? But you'll see we're getting around 120 frames per second. And that is because DLSS frame generation, or any kind of frame generation, does have some slight overhead, right? But now you can see that maintaining 120 frames per second, almost all the time, means that we are getting a base frame rate of 60 frames per second or above all of the time. Now you can see that the 1%, 0.1% lows aren't accurate at all. If I refresh the numbers, they start off very low. It's just the on-screen display recording does not show the lows properly with the new frame gen model. You can see that the frame time graph is very thick. There's no stutter or anything. That's one thing that this game excels at. There's very, very little stutter that I've noticed so far. No traversal stutter, no shadow compilation stutter. And it's a good looking game. Does the performance warrant the visuals, or the visual warrant the performance? Maybe not, but on the ultra high custom preset, the game looks fantastic. You might not be able to see it in the YouTube video because obviously I record at lower quality than what I'm actually seeing in real life, and then YouTube's compression, etc., still gets slapped on top of that. So you might not be able to see the visual quality of the game through a YouTube video. So let's go ahead and disable DLSS here. Actually, sorry, what I wanted to say is I want to test FSR frame generation, because it does seem to be FSR 3.1, because we can use DLSS as an upscaler, and then FSR frame generation, which is good to see. I just want to see what our frame rate looks like now. So it's more or less the same kind of overhead, right? And now you can see that the frame time graph is flat. The lows are fine. 1%, 0.1% lows are perfectly fine. Very little stuttering. I mean, no stuttering. It's a very good experience. It's a very smooth experience, and I'm happy that they took more time. I'm not sure if they changed story elements in the time they delayed the game, or if they optimized it. The game overall is heavy, but at least it's not a stuttery mess as we've seen in many recent cases. All right, so I want to just check one more preset here. I'm just going to enable the high preset instead of the very high preset. Then we'll move on to 4K. The visual quality, we'll be testing the medium preset and that kind of stuff with the ARC B580. Okay, I won't be testing it with the 5080. I don't think people spend $1,000+ on a GPU to be playing at medium presets, right? Unless you obviously are chasing a high frame rate. So I want to make sure that everything is fine. So DLSS native, and then if we drop down to the high preset, now let's see what our performance hit is like. And now the game needs to restart instead of reload. All right, so now on the high preset, getting 70 frames per second here. We're in the same spot. This is basically where it reloads the game to. And I don't know if you noticed, but standing up top there, the view distance is very far. The level of detail distance is also pretty far. I do think it looks pretty good. All right, so it seems like we might be able to maintain 60 frames per second almost all of the time here, using the high preset, still with all the ray tracing options enabled, right? 60-ish frames per second. We are running at native DLAA, and this is really not a bad experience. So if we click on DLSS quality here, we should be able to get around 80 frames per second. As I said, DLSS scaling in this game is kind of broken. It doesn't help that much. And then if we click on frames generation, we should be able to get around 140 frames per second. That's what I'm thinking anyway. So if we go ahead and enable DLSS quality here, let's see if my prediction is correct. And I said 80, we're at 79. So it will drop into the 70s as well. GPU power usage is going quite low again. 80-ish frames per second. I think this is perfect for starting to use frame generation. I actually would play on the very high preset with frame generation and then try and aim for 120 frames per second. I do overclock my 5080. It's a very good overclocker. I do not overclock it for videos because I just know a lot of people do not overclock, and my overclock might be stable at higher overclocks than what yours is, so it's maybe not that good of a representation. Whereas if I test at stock, basically everybody is assured of similar performance, right? That makes sense. But you can see the lows. Look at the 0.1% and the 1% lows. Those are exceptionally good, right? We are seeing an average of 78, 1% lows of 73, and 0.1% lows of 71. I'm actually going to take a screenshot. All right, so I think in that sense, the game is fantastic. Visually, the game is fantastic. Overall frame rate's a bit low, but we've covered that, right? So if we go ahead and enable frame generation here quickly, I'm just going to use DLSS frame generation, not FSR, because the performance is kind of the same with both. Maybe I should use FSR frame generation because the lows actually work with that, okay? There's nothing wrong with the DLSS frame generation. It's just the way the frames are presented with the new model, and on-screen display capture methods have a problem identifying it correctly. Okay, there does seem to be one or two additional stutters here with FSR frame generation enabled, but you can see there was a stutter, which we didn't see earlier, right? But still, we're getting 135 frames per second here. It's not a high refresh rate experience, but it is a high refresh rate motion fluidity output, right? What I mean by that is there is additional input latency penalties when you enable frame generation, and it's not really noticeable at these higher frame rates. At lower frame rates, it's much more noticeable. With a controller, it's not going to be noticeable at all. I'd say if you do play on a controller, I personally would be fine with around 100 frames per second with frame generation enabled, but with the keyboard and mouse, 120 plus is my minimum, because otherwise it just becomes a lot more noticeable. And this game, like, it's not a first-person shooter, so slightly lower input latency would be fine. And as I said, I do apologize, I cannot record the latency numbers now, because I did uninstall the Nvidia app for reasons. Okay, so I think that's going to conclude our 1440p testing with ray tracing enabled anyway. So I just want to show you what the performance differences are when we actually stop using ray tracing. So let's go ahead and disable frame generation here, and I'm going to disable DLSS as well. I mean, let's just use DLAA. Okay, so if we go back into our game here, I just want to get a base frame rate count quickly. Wrong button. So she rolls when I reset the numbers, because I use a combination of Alt and page up, and Alt is roll. Okay, so 62 frames per second native with full ray tracing enabled. Not full ray tracing, all the ray tracing is set to maxed here. So if we go ahead and just enable diffuse lighting, let's see what kind of differences this makes. I don't think we need to restart the save for this to apply. Okay, so we went from 60 to 63 frames per second to around 70, so around 10% increase to our frame rate. Okay, and then sitting with 70 there, I'm just going to leave the frame rate counter up there. And then if we say select diffuse highlight only, which means that the game, it's not applied in the game world. Okay, 70 frames per second then becomes 73 frames per second, 74. Okay, so ray tracing itself is not at this heavy, right? Not that heavy in this game. We're not going to be hitting high frame rates here without ray tracing even. Okay, so I think I think the performance cost for ray tracing is worth it in this game because it really does look very good with ray tracing enabled. And we lose like 10 frames per second when we enable ray tracing at these settings anyway. So I think that's pretty good actually. Now, sure, if I'm going to do one more test, right? At 1440p. If we select the ultra high preset, which I started with, right? The ultra high preset, because obviously ray tracing quality will have an effect on what the performance of ray tracing is. So I'm going to get another baseline here. It's going to ask me to reload. So we'll just have a look, get a base frame rate. I'm going to jump down as I usually do, and then we'll see what the performance differences are when we toggle ray tracing when the quality setting is set to very high, okay, or ultra high, or whatever it's called. So just want to get down here quickly. The little bit I've played of the game so far, I've played about an hour to get to this specific spot. It's a good Assassin's Creed game. I'd quite like it. Okay, 48 frames per second. Okay, let's call it 50 frames per second without any upscaling, right? So 50 frames per second, going to just enable diffuse everywhere. And now it wants to restart. It needs to restart the game. All right, I had to restart the game. I don't know what. All I did was change the ray tracing settings. It seems like some of the settings on the highest setting would require a game restart if some other settings get changed. Very weird. This is going to, I think we were just standing here, we were getting around 50-ish frames per second, right? So we're getting 58, 59, almost 60 frames per second. So that's almost a 20% increase to our frame rate by just going to diffuse only. But the lighting still looks fantastic. And if we then disable ray tracing completely, I hope it doesn't want to restart the game again. It does not even want to reload the save this time. Okay. Very weird. Alright, so things just look a little bit more harsh with this type of setting, but we went from 59 to 64. So the biggest difference would be from enabling diffuse only, okay, if you want a little bit of performance back, but disabling ray tracing completely has almost no performance benefits here, like not even 10%, right, on the 5080 anyway. So I think just leave it on. The game looks fantastic with it on, and without it there's no real difference in the performance, but the game looks very flat without ray tracing though. I'll say that. Okay, enough of 1440p, let's move to 4K. Alright, we are at our fully maxed out settings here with ray tracing fully enabled, 4K, no upscaling, no frames duration, getting 30-ish frames per second. Yeah, I expected worse. I'm not going to lie, right? Based on what I saw online, I expected a lot worse. Just look at our VRAM use. At 4K maximum settings, we are using 8.2 gigabytes of VRAM, and we are allocating 9.8. But now you can see that GPU power is even more, which is to be expected, right? But I was expecting more power draw at the previous settings of 1440p anyway. But 320 watts, yeah, this is more or less what I was personally expecting, and 30-ish frames per second. So I think we should actually see some decent DLSS scaling this time. So I'm going to start off with DLSS scaling. Let me just show you. So native 4K with DLAA. It says custom, but we've got all the ray traced options enabled, and everything here is set to very high. That one can still go ultra high. Does this now require a restart? No, it doesn't. Okay, so let me just see. It should still be 30-ish frames per second. There's no difference in that. Okay, so let's just test DLSS 38 frames per second in that specific spot. Let's see if we see some good scaling here. Let's see, 54. So we did see quite a good boost, but not I think it was a good boost in certain areas. Okay, 50-ish frames per second. I'm going to go back there to that specific spot. As I said, I just want to test the DLSS scaling quickly. Just wanted to run down there because it is a little bit more demanding, see what kind of frame rates we get. But in this spot here, 50, let's let it stabilize, 53 frames per second. Let me just get rid of all that. And if we then go down to balanced, let's see what is required to get 60 frames per second using these settings at 4K. 58, so less of an increase, which makes sense because DLSS quality is 67% resolution per access, and DLSS balanced is 58 or 59, right? So very little difference in the percentages there, but the overall resolution is around 10% lower. Okay, so if we then go to performance, let's see, that should get us above 60 frames per second if the scaling works correctly, which I don't think it does. Okay, once again, it might be the way the lighting works, that the lighting does not scale with resolution, and getting 60 frames per second. So I don't know, sure, we went from 40-ish, well, 35, 40 frames per second to 55, almost 60 frames per second going to DLSS Performance, but typically those gains are a lot more. So whatever, we're going to leave it on DLSS Performance here because I think it does look pretty good. DLSS Performance at 4K, especially on with the new DLSS transformer model. And if we go ahead, I hope the game supports the transformer model, otherwise I'm going to sound like an idiot here. So frame duration, yeah, this is on maxed out settings, right? Just with DLSS Performance. DLSS Quality will see slightly lower frame rates, right? But you should be able to get 80 plus frames per second using these exact same settings. And I think for 4K on, I'm going to call them experimental settings, right? Because they are very, very, very heavy. Okay, so that's fine. Let's move on to a lower preset quickly. I'm going to, I don't think we're going to see DLSS. I keep on saying that. I had to cut that out quite a few times already. I don't think we're going to see 60 frames per second at 4K at all without any upscaling, right? So let's just go with native again, and I'm just going to drop this once again, not to ultra high, just to very high. It might need a restart. All right, so 4K very high native, and once again the gains aren't that big between the presets either, right? So we were seeing between 30 and, I mean, I think we saw 38 frames per second pretty much, and now we are seeing close to that again on the very high preset. So this is, the scaling doesn't work that well at all, which does not bode well for people with mid-range GPUs. Okay, so very high. What was the other setting? Ultra high, right? Yeah, so let's drop this down to high. I'm just going to drop down to high. I'm not going to be testing everything on the very high preset. All right, so 4K on the high preset. Look, we're not seeing any gains here at all, right? Slight gains, but it might be 10%, but at these low frame rates, it's not going to help us much at all. All right, so that's kind of weird. Let's just see. I'm going to disable ray tracing completely quickly. Just want to see what kind of gains we do get here. And as you can see, that the gains are, in terms of numbers, absolute numbers, it's very low. And if we drop down here, because the game is a little bit more demanding down here, as you can see, 48 frames per second. I don't know, the scaling of this game works very weird. DLSS scaling and preset scaling doesn't seem to work that well. All right, I just wanted to test because, as I said, I do think ray tracing is basically a must in this game. It looks fantastic with it on, and the performance cost is really not that bad. So let's go ahead and enable DLSS quality. Let's see if we can hit 60 frames per second. We should, right? I hope. The textures aren't loading in. Are we running out of VRAM here? Do the textures need to look? I don't think the textures was supposed to look that flat. No. Okay. Maybe we need to reload the game. Okay, so 60... Okay, we're not hitting 60 frames per second at all, yeah. In other places, the textures look okay. Anyway, we're only using 6 gigabytes of VRAM with 7.7 allocated. So this would actually work on an 8 gigabyte GPU. Although I don't think an 8 gigabyte, there are 8 gigabyte GPUs in existence that will be able to give you playable frame rates anyway without running out of VRAM, yeah. Even when they're not running out of VRAM, I should say. So let's just try DLSS Performance here. So I'll show you in the other video that dropping down to the medium preset actually does increase the frame rate a little bit, but the game starts to look very bad. Okay, especially when you drop down to the medium preset and you start disabling ray tracing, the game starts to look very, very bad. Even here, there's some pop in. I don't know, 70 frames per second. If you do have a 4K monitor and you're aiming for 60 frames per second, this is basically what you'll have to do, right? DLSS Performance, high preset. A little bit disappointing, as I said, because even if we do disable ray tracing, it's not that big of a boost to our frame rate. And then if we go ahead and just enable frame generation, yeah, I'm going to use, let's just use DLSS frame generation, because I just want to see if the stuttering persists. Even though we can't record the lows, we can still see stuttering in the frame time graph. Okay, so just going to remove that, sorry. So 130-ish frames per second, 120. So you get a high refresh rate output with a little bit of additional input latency. That's just how frame generation works, right? But it feels perfectly fine. I'm not going to lie. On the keyboard and mouse, using these settings, it feels fine. There's no problem for me anyway with the input latency on the mouse. And as I said, the game is slower paced. Not slower paced, but like you don't need exceptionally fast erratic movements like you do in a Doom Eternal, for example, right? Or some other first-person shooter game. I think this is okay. The experience is okay. Game is heavy, but frame times are very good, and scaling is broken. To summarize. Alright, so I think that's going to be where we leave this video. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.